So today we're doing chapter 15, which is on psychological disorders. And after this, you only have to hear me lecture one more time. So next week is treatment of psychological disorders. So the last two chapters, obviously a lot of overlap. And then the week after that is lab day. We won't be meeting here, we'll be meeting in the psych lab. I'll remind you of that next week. It's my first time seeing this particular type of lab. The 1,100 people are doing brain dissections. You guys are going to be diagnosing people. I don't know if it's like a written description or if they have, I'm pretty sure it's written, but we'll see what they have in store for us then. And then of course after that is the final. I want to begin this chapter with a warning against doing something, and that is self-diagnosis. As you all have noticed from being alive, life is hard, and the late teens, early 20s come with their own challenges. If you're in a bad mood and have a little bit of confirmation bias, easy to find yourself in various disorders. There's two reasons to not do that. One is it's a good way to make yourself miserable, and another reason, because of things that will become clear as I go on, I think that that's putting more faith in the diagnostic system than it deserves. As we will see throughout this chapter, including the beginning, the process of determining what the boundaries are between a mental disorder and ordinary experience is somewhat arbitrary. And in fact, that's one of the first things I'm going to talk about now. That's the fundamental issue in defining psychological disorders. All or virtually all psychological disorders are continuous with ordinary experience. And this makes it very difficult to draw a bright line. So the example I used on Monday was depression. So think of sadness existing on a range. So you can imagine at one end, you open the cookie jar and there's no cookies. Oh, you feel sad for like 2 minutes. And then over here, there may be someone who, is seriously depressed. They can barely get out of, excuse me. They can barely get out of bed in the morning. They're constantly crying. They have recurrent thoughts of suicide, maybe even plans of suicide, extremely low energy, etc. Okay, clearly, that person needs some kind of help. And based on our criteria, would definitely classify as having major depression. But then in the middle, there's the full range of heartbreak and bad mood that's just part of everyday life. Okay, where do we draw a line and say, okay, past here, now we're going to diagnose you with major depression? And the answer is we draw it somewhere, right? And empirical evidence can inform where we draw this line, but in a sense that would make some clinical psychologists uncomfortable, it is a matter of choice where to put the line. And to make this clear, I'll actually show you the DSM-5 criteria. So I should say, we'll talk more about this throughout the chapter, at least in North America, the standard for diagnosing mental disorders is the DSM 5th edition, or DSM-5. DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, obviously 5th edition. So this has the criteria for each of the mental disorders. This is what psychiatrists use to diagnose people. The international one is the ICD, but you don't have to worry about that one for this class. And so here's the DSM-5 criteria for depression. So there are 8 symptoms, and you have to have at least 5. And you don't have to memorize the details, it's just to give you a flavor of how the DSM works. You have to have at least 5, and at least one of them has to be the first 2. So the first 2 are depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Okay, makes sense. Second one is markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. Then there are various other symptoms like suicidal thoughts, low energy, etc. And as I say, you have to have at least 5, including one of the first 2. Now, how long? The answer is 2 weeks. Now, did God come down and say that's where the line should be? No, it's partly a matter of judgment. If you say it should be a month, you can make that argument. So where to draw this line is somewhat arbitrary. This is another reason why self-diagnosis is not necessarily all that informative. It's not clear to me, at least, how much information you gain by finding out whether you're on one side or another of this arbitrary line that's been set. It's what it really is useful for, and I don't know if I mentioned this on Monday, but it's useful for clinicians talking to each other. You get kind of a quick snapshot picture of the kinds of symptoms this person is likely to have. That's really what diagnoses are useful for, but as I say, the lines are somewhat arbitrary. Many disorders in the DSM-5 will include the criterion that they have to cause clinically significant distress or impairment. So by distress, meaning it has to be unpleasant to experience. So if you have the symptoms, but your life's going fine, you don't feel ill at ease about it, then you won't qualify. Impairment or impairment of functioning means the disorder has to interfere with your ability to do your job, go to school, interact with friends, etc. The book goes through kind of a brief history of approaches to this. There's kind of it's shorter in this textbook than it is in other textbooks. In a lot of textbooks that gloss over the history of the different sciences, you'll get the following picture. Now, this is overly simplistic, but it's good to at least know that this is the standard first approximation that you'll get in a lot of books. The way a lot of books talk about the history of human thought is prior to the ancient Greeks, there was ignorance. No one really knew what the stars were or how to figure out what's true about the world. And then the ancient Greeks had this funny idea that we shouldn't rely on tradition or superstition, we should reason about the world. We should, in the case of people like Aristotle, we should use observation, right? A kind of an early version of the scientific method. And in relation to treating psychological and behavioral problems, the ancient Greeks were also the first to do so in a medically oriented way. Prior to the ancient Greeks, if people had behavioral or psychological problems, it was ascribed to things like demonic possession. There's evidence that one early method of treating this was drilling holes in people's heads to let the demons out. So the ancient Greeks said, no, these problems result from biological causes. Now, their actual theories about how these biological causes worked were kind of crazy, but they were early attempts to explain psychological and behavioral problems in biological terms. So people like Hippocrates and Galen threw around ideas like it has to do with balance between different levels of fluids. We now know that that's pretty crazy, but as I say, it was an early attempt to give a biological account. This is a little bit unfair, but in this standard account of history, it's argued that during the medieval period, there was kind of a backsliding, less emphasis on reason and evidence, and more attention given to supernatural causes. That's more true in Europe. It turns out that in the Islamic world, there was a continuation of kind of the Greek tradition. They preserved many of the works of people like Aristotle and so on. And then, of course, you have the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, in which there was a return to the idea of relying on evidence, observation, and not blindly trusting tradition or authority. And when it comes to treating behavioral problems, there was also a move back towards what the book calls the medical model, which you could argue there are early versions of this in ancient Greece. The medical model is the idea, as I said earlier, that psychological problems result from biological causes and therefore can be treated. I didn't mention this on Monday, but that perspective still has its critics today. So if you go on and take a class like Critical Issues, or probably even Abnormal Psychology, his name will come up. There's someone named Thomas Szasz who wrote a provocative book called The Myth of Mental Illness, in which he argues that conceptualizing psychological problems as illnesses is misguided. We don't get into that in this course, but especially in North America, the medical model is still the dominant perspective. So, I won't test you on the details of this, but that's a good rough history to have in the back of your head. Back to the DSM-5, so the book has a more detailed discussion of it here. It goes through the 22 categories of mental disorders. You do not have to memorize that. If you take abnormal psych later on, you will have to learn them, but you don't need that level of detail. I remember when I first took this course, I guess it would be 10 years ago, my professor, Arnold Serra, who, he was a real character. I didn't say this on Monday, but he always wore Crocs, jeans, and a shirt. Not that I can judge outfits, I guess, but, and he would just sit down, and he would call on people too. Like, he would just be like, "What do you think, sir?" And then, like, people would have to answer. One guy did one time say, "To be honest, I'm not very good at answering your questions." And Serra did respect that. He's like, "All right, fair enough." Didn't ask him a question again, but Serra, when he got to this section, said, the DSM-5 was not given to us on gold tablets from God, right? It's a human product and therefore flawed. One famous example of this that he mentioned is the case of homosexuality. So early editions of the DSM listed homosexuality as a mental illness. And this was recent enough that Arnold Serra himself, when he was starting his practice as a clinician, was treating people for this disorder. And then the DSM changed. They removed that as a diagnosis. So one gentleman who was gay and getting treatment from Arnold Serra came in for his weekly therapy, and Dr. Serra said, "I have good news. You're cured." "What do you mean? I still, And he's like, "Nope, it's not a disorder anymore. Therapy's over. You're good to go." So that's an older example that's kind of funny now. But the DSM-5 has its critics too, so there were a number of changes made. One that's received a lot of criticism is, and I won't test you on this, but just to give you a flavor of the kinds of debates, they got rid of the bereavement exclusion for depression. So think back to those symptoms I showed for depression. For 2 weeks or more, you have low mood plus a number of other symptoms. Most of the day, nearly every day. And if you have that, you're considered to have a mental disorder. The older editions, like say the DSM-4, had this, which meant if you had those symptoms, but like your spouse just died, you weren't diagnosed with depression. It's like, well, that's normal. DSM-5 got rid of this, so now if your spouse dies and you are sad for 2 weeks, most of the time, nearly every day, plus like sleep problems and a few other things, you are considered to have a mental disorder, which seems, many have argued, kind of silly. One question that many people ask about these disorders is, can you be diagnosed with more than one at a time? And the answer is yes. That's an example of the key term comorbidity. So that co meaning like together. So this means you have more than one disorder at the same time. And some disorders are highly comorbid. For example, if you have depression, I forget the number, I think it's something like there's a 50% chance you'll also have a diagnosable anxiety condition. So mood and anxiety conditions are highly comorbid. Some disorders seem to be culturally specific. So this is what the book calls cultural syndromes. It gives the example of Japan. Japan as a culture has very strict social rules. And there appears to be a particular set of symptoms, social anxiety plus a few others, that kind of hang together. It has a name that I'm not going to try to pronounce, and this is considered a cultural symptom. It's a particular set of symptoms you tend to only see in Japan. One example that some people have argued is culture-bound is multiple personality disorder, or as it's now called, dissociative identity disorder. Only seems to exist in Western culture. It's a very controversial diagnosis even there, for reasons that we'll see in the next chapter. So I won't test you on the specific examples, but it's good to know that some disorders seem to be culturally specific. Other disorders are not at all like that. So schizophrenia, very stable at around 1% of the population, pretty much everywhere you go. So that is an example of a disorder that seems to be relatively unaffected by culture. And as I'll say later, in case you're a little confused right now, schizophrenia is not multiple personality disorder. Some people, I don't know who started that, it's like a thing you see in the movies, but it's a totally different diagnosis. Okay, next term, diathesis stress model. This is about what causes different disorders. Strictly speaking, it's supposed to be an explanation of all disorders. The idea here is for a disorder to emerge, you need two ingredients. A diathesis, which is just a fancy term that means vulnerability. And a stressor, which is something in the environment that triggers the disorder. So the type of vulnerability or diathesis that's most talked about in this chapter is genetic vulnerabilities. So like everything in psychology, psychological disorders are partly heritable. What's our evidence for that? The clearest case, as always, is twin studies. So identical twins are more likely to be similar, or to be concordant, as they say, for a disorder. So to take an extreme case, in the case of schizophrenia, which is a very heritable disorder, if one twin has schizophrenia, the other has a much greater chance of having it. So in the general population, schizophrenia, as I say, is about 1%. But if your identical twin has it, you have about a 50% chance of having it. You can have other types of vulnerabilities too. So for example, early learning or early conditioning could put you at risk for different types of disorders. But genetic risk is the easiest one to think about. Having said that, think again about the identical twin case. So if one twin has schizophrenia, The other has a 50% chance, which is much, much higher than it is in the general population, but still not 100%. So presumably there has to be something in their experience, something in the environment that triggers it in one but not the other. That's the stress component. Different theories as to what that could be, but again, the idea is you need both to get the disorder. One type of risk or diathesis that's receiving increased attention now is the concept of intergenerational trauma. So this is the idea that, trauma can be passed on in various ways. You can imagine different mechanisms for this. So if it's abuse, say, the abuse, of course, can be passed on directly. Conceivably, epigenetics could be a variable. So there's a lot of evidence now that different experiences, including traumatic ones, can change how your genes express themselves, and that can in turn be passed on. I talk more about that in 1100, but whatever the mechanism is, there is evidence that intergenerational trauma is real. So one sad case that's close to home in Canada is residential schools. So if a parent or grandparent went to a residential school, the kids and or grandkids are more likely to have disorders and or sadly commit suicide. So that would be an example of intergenerational trauma. So this is about the causes of disorders, and you'll have debates in the literature about which causes are more important, how much of the variation they explain. But crucially, the DSM-5 in their criteria for different disorders don't talk about causation. So it's purely, the definitions of disorders are purely based on symptoms. And the book mentions that there's a growing movement to try and change this, try and include in the definitions of disorders how they are caused. So the book mentions something called the Research Domain Criteria Project. That's just an example of a group that's trying to develop conceptions of mental disorders where the cause is part of the definition. Another thing that people are trying to change, and there were some early attempts at this in the DSM-5, although they didn't really amount to much, is people are trying to move away from a categorical approach and towards a dimensional approach. If you define mental disorders in a categorical way, that means you view them as on or off. You either get diagnosed with depression or OCD or schizophrenia, or you don't. And the way that the DSM works is it's categorical, right? So take the depression case, once you hit 5 symptoms, including one of the first 2, then you get diagnosed with depression. It's a little strange for reasons that I already hinted at. Let's say you have 4 symptoms. Is someone with 4 symptoms really all that different from someone with 5? Not really. So the categorical approach seems somewhat arbitrary, so there's a growing move towards conceptualizing disorders as continuous. So one example is where there was some attempt to do this more seriously was personality disorders, which we'll talk more about at the end of the chapter. So the two most widely studied personality disorders are borderline personality disorder, which the core symptom there is emotional instability. And the other is antisocial personality disorder, which is basically synonymous with what people call psychopathy or being a psychopath. And again, rather than view these as on or off, you can view these as being high or low in various dimensions. So you don't have to memorize this example, but as I say, there's a growing push towards moving in that direction. Do these two terms make sense? One reason to worry, I guess, about the categorical approach is, as the book puts it, there are dangers in labeling people as, having a given disorder or being crazy or being disordered. And this was brought out by a really nice, I don't know if it's sometimes called an experiment. It's not an experiment in the technical sense, but let's call it a demonstration done by David Rosenhan. So Rosenhan was worried about the conditions in psychiatric hospitals. And he and his colleagues, including, I believe, some of his graduate students, did the following. They checked themselves into psychiatric hospitals and claimed to have one symptom, hearing voices. That's it. Other than that, they behaved completely normally. But given that they were now, labeled as crazy, they were treated quite poorly, ignored a lot of the time by the staff, and they were kept in, I think he mentions in the video what the average was. I believe it was something like 14 days was the average amount of time they were kept in, even though, again, they reported no more symptoms and behaved completely normally. But once you're in the crazy bucket, anything you do can be seen as evidence of crazy. Like, hey doc, when am I getting out? I'm feeling better. That's just what a crazy person. It's easy to essentially use confirmation bias when interpreting their behavior. So to say a bit more about that, I have some footage of David Rosenhan himself talking about this stuff. Okay. Okay, so before getting into some specific disorders, I want to talk about one applied issue that is good to know about, and that's the issue of criminal responsibility. So in the old days, if you were found not criminally responsible, the term that was used was insane, like not criminally responsible by reason of insanity. Now we just say not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. Crucially though, not any mental disorder will do. So, if you kill a bunch of people and it turns out that you're a psychopath and you just feel no empathy and you enjoy killing people, you will not be found not criminally responsible. That doesn't matter. The disorder in question has to interfere with your ability to understand what you're doing or what's going on. So there's a famous Canadian case of this, of a person who has schizophrenia who beheads someone on a bus. So some of you may have heard of this case. So I forget what I think he thought he was attacking a demon or something like that. So he did not have a clear sense of what was going on. In a case like that, if the evidence is good enough, you'll be found, as I say, not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. Now, that doesn't mean you get to go free. It just means that you're not going to be punished. What's going to happen is you're going to be treated. You'll be locked in, a psychiatric hospital and treated. What it does mean is, if there is a very high degree of certainty or confidence that you won't reoffend, then you will be released. You're not held for a set amount of time to be punished. You are held to be treated. And so in this case, the guy was let go. I forget after how long, but after many years of treatment, it was determined he was no longer a risk. So this is partly, of course, a political question, but that's kind of the state of the art now. There is kind of a case, there's a case I wrote a paper about in undergrad. One guy did try to game, well, I'm sure many have, but one guy in particular tried to game the system. He was an American serial killer and tried to fake multiple personality disorder, or as we now say, dissociative identity disorder. And he managed to fool 3 psychiatrists into thinking he had it. Um, there were two things that revealed he was faking. One was one psychiatrist was skeptical, and so while interviewing him, he just mentioned in passing, turns out most people with DID have at least 3 personalities. This guy had only had 2, like the murderer one and the normal one. And what do you know? The next time he was under hypnosis, a 3rd personality emerged. So that was one thing. The final, nail in the coffin, was they raided his house and found psychology textbooks with those sections underlined. Turns out just your garden variety psychopath. So he's still in prison. Okay. Any questions before we move on to different types of disorders, which will take up basically the rest of the chapter? Okay. The first umbrella of types of disorders is anxiety disorders. So we'll go through a number of different examples. And I should start off by saying, anxiety is an adaptive emotion. The way that Paul Bloom puts this, who I think I have his lectures linked in the syllabus if you want to hear about this course in his words. So there's a bell curve, right, of anxiety. If you're way over here, you wind up in the psychiatric hospital, right, if you have too much anxiety. If you're over here, you probably wind up dead, right? If you're never worried about anything and you take crazy risks and they're never afraid, good chance you wind up in either in prison or dead. So anxiety, part of what it does, it keeps you from doing foolish things. But of course, there are problems to being on this end of the curve, and we'll see some examples of that. One common one is phobic disorder, or having specific phobias. A phobia is an irrational fear of something. Some could be a specific object, could be a situation. So many of you will know the terms here. So like claustrophobia, is fear of being in an enclosed space. Agoraphobia is fear of being in public. So they tend to stay home. Of course, arachnophobia, very common, right? Fear of spiders. The book mentions something called social phobia, more commonly referred to as social anxiety disorder. You can think of this as weapons-grade shyness. So they're very afraid of being socially evaluated, and as a result are very, very shy. And to be clear, and this will help contrast it with disorders we'll see later, these are people who want normal human relationships, they're just too afraid of being socially evaluated. So I knew someone who had this, and once you got to know him, he was very funny and outgoing, etc. But if it was someone new, it was very, very intimidating, and he was diagnosed with this. One example, he was used to his barber. He had a particular barber, and the barber either passed away or quit, I forget which, and he couldn't go to a new barber. That was just too much social interaction with a new person. As a result, he looked like Jesus. He already had a beard, but he let his hair grow out, so he looked like Jesus. So there's important work here under what's called a preparedness theory. Which I know I've talked about in 1100. I mixed the classes up. Have we talked about this in 1200? Okay, I did. Before I define it, here's a question I asked on Monday. How many of you know someone who has a phobia of cars? How many of you know someone who has a phobia of spiders? Right. Now, stop and think about that. That's very strange. Likely no one you know has ever been harmed in any serious way by a spider. In the environment in which we live, spiders pose basically zero threat, whereas cars pose a very serious threat. And if you're a simple-minded kind of behaviorist, this should be very surprising. It's all just conditioning and association formation. But if you think about human nature from an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. In the environment in which we evolved, small insects were very dangerous, same with snakes and stuff like that. Whereas cars, not so big of a problem to worry about. And so the idea of preparedness theory is that there are certain kinds of fears or associations that are easier to make. We come in more prepared to be afraid of certain things. So like, what are the most common phobias? Fear of heights, fear of social evaluation, right? Public speaking or other things like that. And small, scary-looking animals. Well, saying scary-looking is kind of begging the question, but fear of the kinds of animals that would have been dangerous in the ancestral environment. Okay. Another anxiety condition is panic disorder. So this is a condition in which people suffer from what are called panic attacks. So panic attacks are sudden, intense episodes of anxiety. And these are very intense anxieties. So sometimes they're intense enough that people go to the hospital reporting that they've had a heart attack, right? So, and this will be someone just at the mall doing their thing, minding their own business, and all of a sudden they have this sense of impending doom. Their heart rate goes up, their blood pressure goes up, and if they're not aware they have the disorder, they can think they have a heart attack or are having a heart attack. I will confess, I once at least contributed to someone having a panic attack. Now, they don't have to have a specific cause. In this case, they did, which was partly me. They can happen, as I say, just the mall. You just be walking along and have a panic attack. But this one was a little bit my fault. So I've been on a lot of flights in my life. So I lived in Atlanta and Edmonton for a while. And especially when I was in Edmonton, it was super easy to fly back and forth to home. In fact, one summer, I was working in a lab only 2 or 3 days a week, and they were in a row. And it was cheaper to fly home and steal food from my mom than to buy food at home. Because the flights, if you fly with a place like Flair, at that point were around like $19 sometimes. So very, very cheap. So I got sick of hearing the safety demos, right? Because you hear it over and over again. And so I was kind of grumbling about it. They told me to take my headphones off. I'm like, this is bullshit. And the woman beside me was like, oh, I know, it's kind of silly. And I was in a surly mood, so I said, and furthermore, we're flying over the Rocky Mountains. If this plane goes down, we are all dead. Like it doesn't matter if we follow the safety demonstrations. And she was like, oh my God, don't say that, right? And then, as fate would have it, we had a very turbulent flight because it was Flair, so you get what you pay for. So her resultant panic attack, I think, was at least a little bit my fault. Okay, that's that one. Another type of anxiety condition, generalized anxiety disorder. Sort of the opposite of panic disorder in a way. So this is constant low-level anxiety. I believe in the DSM-5, the cutoff is you have to experience it for at least 6 months. I had a philosophy professor who hated psychology. When he heard of this, he was very angry. Like he said, oh, I heard of this disorder. It's called generalized anxiety disorder. That's called being alive. So that was his take on that. Maybe a little bit of truth in that. Now, as an example of these, I'm going to show a video from a movie, What About Bob? Bob, at least at the beginning of the movie, would qualify for many of the disorders we've talked about. Now it is a comedy, but I'm not poking fun at Bob. I will note, spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, Bob becomes a psychiatrist, and his psychiatrist becomes crazy. So there's an interesting, maybe there's a social message there, I don't know. But it's a nice illustration of several anxiety disorders. Okay. So those are all the anxiety disorders we have to talk about. What about different causes? So as with the other disorders, they are moderately heritable. Anxiety disorders on the lower end, maybe 30–40%, if you use the standard estimates. Although what some studies find is what's heritable is not so much any specific anxiety disorder, but a general proclivity towards getting one of the anxiety disorders. So, like if your mom was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, you might get panic disorder, you might get phobic disorder, but you'll probably get, or at least you're at increased risk of getting one of the anxiety disorders. So this is a disorder with a sex difference. As we'll see there, it kind of evens out. Different disorders have sex differences going different ways. For anxiety, more women on average are diagnosed with anxiety disorders. Again, with explanations, one important family of explanations that will come up with various disorders is different cognitive explanations. So remember that cognitive psychologists explain behavior and thinking, in this case, they explain psychological disorders in terms of thinking, in terms of what people believe, how they process information about the world, things like that. An important term here is what cognitive therapists call catastrophizing. This is a pattern of thinking that contributes to anxiety disorders. And it's one that's irrational. The job of a cognitive therapist is to challenge this kind of irrational thinking. What is catastrophizing? It's reasoning in such a way that you always jump to the worst possible outcome. So let's say you get criticized by your boss. That's not fun. No one likes getting criticized by their boss. And perfectly normal to be a little upset about that. If you have an anxiety disorder, what you may do is, okay, my boss criticized me. He's probably going to fire me. And then I'll probably run out of money. And then I'll probably wind up homeless. And once I'm homeless, I'm going to get murdered in the streets. Or whatever. That's kind of an extreme case, but this is a pattern you find, that people with this disorder often reason this way right to the worst possible outcome, and that's irrational. So as I say, the job of a cognitive therapist is to challenge that kind of inference. So that's cognitive. A different family of explanations is behavioral explanations. So this family of explanations grows out of the work the behaviorists did. So the behaviorists did a lot of work on different types of conditioning. One type of conditioning is classical conditioning. This is the Pavlov's dog type of conditioning, so association type conditioning. So in the Pavlov's dog experiment, you ring the bell, give the dog food, ring the bell, give the dog food. At first, obviously, the dog only salivates to the food, but as they are repeatedly paired, eventually the dog salivates just to the sound of the bell. So it's easy to see how that kind of ability to make associations could contribute to anxiety disorders. So take phobias. Someone's afraid of a specific kind of animal. If they have a traumatic event with that animal early on, it's a kind of classically conditioned association. They now associate that animal with danger, just like the Pavlov's dog associates the bell with the food is coming. So that's a simple case. This one's a bit weirder to explain, but operant conditioning can also contribute. So operant conditioning is reward and punishment. So this is like the Skinner, B.F. Skinner studies where you have the rat in the cage or the pigeon, and you give it a treat every time it pecks a certain color of disc or something like that, and you get the pigeon to peck the disc more. So very simple idea that when a behavior is rewarded, it increases in frequency. No surprise. One type of reward, though, or reinforcement, to use Skinner's term, is if you take away something bad. So if you're electrocuting the rat, and then when he gets the treat, you take the electrocution away, that's one way of reinforcing that behavior or rewarding the behavior. And anxiety conditions can get entrenched in just this way. So let's say I have a phobic disorder, I'm afraid of something. Every time I see it, I feel anxiety. What do? Move away from the thing. What happens? My anxiety goes down. Sweet relief. What do I do now? I avoid the thing more. So this is a way in which operant conditioning, or reward and punishment, can help to entrench anxiety conditions. We'll see in the next chapter how principles the behaviorist discovered can be used for therapy. You probably can see where it's going. This is, of course, the basis of exposure therapy, which we'll be talking a lot about in the next chapter. Any questions about these types of explanations? Okay, next. OCD. Obsessive compulsive disorder. So in everyday speech, we sometimes use this to tease our friends if they're very neat and orderly. But of course, OCD is more than that. The right way to think about it is to break down the words. So there's two ingredients to obsessive compulsive disorder: obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions, the first ingredient, are persistent, unwanted thoughts that you can't stop. You can't get them out of your head. Compulsions are behaviors or rituals that you engage in to get rid of the obsessions. You get a kind of vicious circle where they reinforce each other. So you can have different versions. The one that's easiest to understand is cleanliness or germ-related obsessions. So someone has the obsession with cleanliness or disease or something like that, and they just can't get the thought out of their head. So that's the obsession part, is the thought that I might get sick, my food might be contaminated, my hands are dirty. The compulsion might be excessive hand washing. And I don't mean that's a little odd. I mean to the point where your hands are too dry or your skin bleeds, over and over and over again, and you're never satisfied that your hands are clean. So there are all kinds of other versions. I mean, in some funny cases, the obsession can be a religious obsession, like you believe that God is mad at you, and you'll do ritualistic type things to reduce that obsession. But as I say, the easiest case to understand is the cleanliness one. If you want to get an intuitive feel for what this would be like, here's a real life case that probably most of you have had. You turn the oven off and you go to sit down to watch TV. And you think, shit, did I turn the oven off? You go back to double check. maybe even do it like a second time. Or you lock the door, you leave to go back, and you're like, wait, did I lock the door? Go back again. It's a very common experience. Now imagine that, so there's a kind of thought that pops into your head, and you do a behavior to get rid of the thought. Imagine that, but the thought never goes away. You keep going back to check the stove, or you keep going back to double check that you locked the door. And that kind of runaway pattern is basically what OCD is. So actually, I'll show a video of someone who puts in his own words what it's like. This is John Green, so I'm sure many of you know, how many of you know John Green? So author of Fault in Our Stars, and him and his brother do Crash Course, lots of great stuff. So here's a video of him talking about, so he has OCD. And here he talks about what it's like. Okay, so he goes on, but that's a good description. Okay, any questions about OCD? Okay, next, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, the name is helpful here. So post, of course, means after. Traumatic here means some kind of traumatic event. So maybe the most common one is experience in war, like soldiers in battle, but also sexual assault, various other things. And this is marked by bouts of anxiety, but also recurrent flashbacks that interfere with your ability to live a normal life. They are flashbacks and bouts of fear that you are unable to control. Another clip. So it's a bit of an odd clip. This is from the TV show The West Wing. So the character in question got shot, and this scene kind of alternates between three scenes. So one is him in an office with a therapist, and then he's talking about how he was at this concert. And at the concert, he had a big flashback that messed up his ability to stay in the concert, because as we discover in the episode, music is his trigger. Every time he hears music, it makes him think of the sirens, which in turn makes him think of the experience of getting shot. So it goes between the office with the therapist, the concert, and the shooting, but it's a very vivid representation of what PTSD is like. Okay. So the book has an interesting discussion of one risk factor for PTSD. This wasn't in my old textbook. It's kind of an interesting finding. PTSD is correlated with having a smaller hippocampus, so less hippocampal volume. Now, that might seem kind of surprising given that the hippocampus is involved in memory. Now, of course, one thing you have to right away remind yourself is that correlation doesn't mean causation. So it could be that having a small hippocampus is a risk factor for developing PTSD. So the causal arrow can go small hippocampus to PTSD, or it can go the other way, that having PTSD leads to hippocampal atrophy, that the hippocampus shrinks afterwards. So tough to test, but researchers thought of a really clever way of testing for this. They looked at veterans with PTSD. So these are soldiers who develop PTSD after seeing combat. And as I say, they had smaller hippocampi. What they did was looked at their identical twins who did not have PTSD. And what they found was the twins also had smaller hippocampi. So that supports the idea that the smaller hippocampus is a risk factor for developing PTSD. So what might be going on here? There's evidence that if you do, sort of induce trauma in rats, rats with smaller hippocampi are less able to learn. The hippocampus is involved in learning and memory. To learn that, okay, this is the dangerous situation where I saw the trauma last time, this other environment is safe and I can be okay here. So it might be that what's going on is people with PTSD have difficulty learning and associating that, okay, now I'm not in war anymore, I'm not safe, I don't have to be freaking out all the time. At least that's one interpretation of the data. Okay, any questions? Next family is mood disorders, but that's probably a natural place for a break. So let's take 10 just to make sure we have time to finish everything. So come back at 11:05. Okay. So mood disorders, in a way, hardly need an introduction. So these are problems with one's mood, with one's emotional state. So one we've already spent some time talking about, which is major depressive disorder, or colloquially just called depression. So as we saw earlier, this is having low mood or loss of interest in activities most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks, plus a number of other symptoms. There's a different condition which used to be called dysthymia, which is now called persistent depressive disorder, which is, I suppose, similar to generalized anxiety disorder. It's so this is low mood for a long period of time, although typically not as severe as major depressive disorder. I should add that in the case of dysthymia or persistent depressive disorder, it has to be at least 2 years. If the depression is seasonal, it's given the easy to remember acronym SAD, seasonal affective disorder. So people who only get depressed typically in the winter months because of the decreased sunlight. Does anyone know what the treatment is?
It's like a sun box thing, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah. You look at a light for an hour.
I had a friend that had it, and he felt like a disc one.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we are animals, so simple things like that do work. As with anxiety conditions, major depression is more common in women on average. There is a particular neurotransmitter that's received a lot of attention here, which is serotonin. So as we'll see in the next chapter, the most commonly prescribed antidepressants act on serotonin. So these are SSRIs, very famous medications. They're now used for all sorts of things. And we'll see more detail about the exact mechanism next chapter, but basically what they do is they increase how much serotonin gets sent between neurons. They do it in this funny indirect way, but that's the consequence of the drugs. And these do reduce depression, not very much, but slightly more than placebo. What many people inferred from that is, low serotonin must be what causes depression. But that inference is not justified. I forget if I said this in this class, but if I give you heroin, you will be happier, at least for a while. That doesn't mean that low heroin was the cause of your sadness earlier. And in fact, as I'll mention in the next chapter, there was a recent really good meta-analysis that looked at all the available studies that try to measure levels of depression in depressed people and found when you average it all together, there's no difference, that depressed people do not have lower average levels of serotonin. Now, given that increasing it does reduce depression, there must be something going on with serotonin, but it's not as simple as depressed people have low serotonin. Again, evidence of heritability, if you look at twin studies, although not especially high. So if you use the model, so you can get an estimate of heritability using the twin studies. If you trust those models, the number you get for depression is it's something like 30 to 40% heritable. But over on the other side, you see bipolar and schizophrenia over 80% heritable. So as far as disorders go, depression is on the lower end. To make that concrete, identical twins are less similar for this disorder than they are for some of the more heritable disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar. Autism too, very, very heritable. There's an influential cognitive explanation of depression. The book calls it helplessness theory. That's not a good term for it. The term I've put in the key terms is depressed or depressive attributional style. So remember back from social psychology that an attribution is an explanation that people make. In the context of depression, it means an explanation of why something happened. So you're going through your life, something happens, and you tell a story about why it happened. And the idea here is that depressed people have a specific way of explaining things that happen to them. And it's almost the opposite of self-serving bias, if you could put it that way, if it's helpful. Depressed people explain events differently when they are good versus when they are bad. So let's say I'm really depressed. I have depression. No, not actually. If I have depression, here's what I'll do. Let's say something good happens. So I get hired. I'm glad I got this job, so I get hired. That's a good event. In a case like that, I will make external, unstable, and local attributions. So I'll go through these. So external, I only got hired because of Douglas College. It's not because of my traits. They just must have really low standards for faculty. That's why I got the job. Unstable, total fluke, just kind of random good luck. And local, only this place would hire me, because again, it's a total fluke, it's just because of them, so it's not going to happen anywhere else. Let's say something bad happens. So Douglas fires me. That's it. You're out of here. Then I do the opposite. I make internal, stable, and global attributions. So first of all, it's all my fault. So the attribution is purely internal. Stable. If I had some shortcomings, I will always have them. It's not that I could improve my skills. Nope, I will just always be like this. And global. This isn't just one weakness I have or one shortcoming I have. This shows that I'm a bad person overall. Now, that's kind of depressing to think like that. So having this pattern of thinking is, again, something that a cognitive therapist would challenge. And it's not to say it's never your fault. I mean, that would be irrational too, but The point is, depressed people have a bias towards always thinking in these terms. There's an evolutionary explanation of depression that's getting increased attention, and that's analytical rumination. So rumination means to think about something over and over again, like to kind of dwell on it. And this is an explanation that's somewhat conjectural. There are attempts to test different predictions that follow from it, but evolutionary hypotheses are famously sometimes hard to test. But the basic idea here is that depression is a natural response to sudden changes that happen. So you are used to thinking of your life in a certain way, you have certain goals and values and assumptions. You get a big signal that that won't work anymore. So, one famous frequent cause of depression is a breakup, right? So you've organized your life and your emotions around one person, and now it's like, oh, no, that's not the way your life's going to go anymore. And depression is a way of forcing you to slow down and, to put it crudely, rewire your brain, kind of reevaluate and rethink about your values. So analytic means like to analyze something. So that's a somewhat speculative evolutionary explanation. Now this is a study that doesn't show that this is true, but it's kind of an interesting finding. There was a study that showed that thinking about depression as a natural adaptive response is associated with better treatment outcomes. So they put people in two conditions. One of them, they said, you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. The other said, this is a natural adaptive response that helps you think about things. And that second one was associated with better treatment outcomes. Again, doesn't show that the explanation is right, but turns out it's associated with better outcomes. I have a clip of Cosmes and Tooby talking about this, but I want to be careful and make sure we finish. So skip that. If you want, you can ask me through the video. Okay, so everything I've said so far is mainly about major depressive disorder. But as the book notes, this is also called unipolar depression. So uni, of course, means one. So this means, one extreme. So unipolar depression is one thing. The other one, a totally different mood disorder, is bipolar disorder. So bi, of course, means two. So here there's two extremes. So one is depression, similar set of symptoms as major depression. And the other, does anyone know the term for the other extreme in bipolar?
Mania.
Mania. So mania, or you can also say being manic, that'd be the adjective. So this used to be called manic depressive disorder, but in the DSM-5 it's just called bipolar. Many people, when they hear about this, assume that it's describing a person who's emotionally unstable, like minute to minute or hour to hour, but that's not what this is. That would be closer to what the DSM calls borderline disorder, which is a totally different disorder. These periods of mania and depression last weeks to months. Unfortunately, depression typically longer. Now you might think, well, mania sounds fun. This is the opposite of depression. Does that just mean like you're really happy all the time? And remember what I said earlier, that emotions like anxiety and even sadness can serve adaptive functions. At the very least, they keep you from doing foolish things. Why don't you streak through the streets or spend all your money or cheat on your spouse? Well, it's because you're afraid of the negative emotions. You think, oh, I'd be embarrassed, or I'd feel bad about not having money, or I'd feel guilty, etc. So if it's all positive emotion, you do a lot of impulsive, foolish things, which is basically what happens here. So when people are in full-blown mania, they tend to sleep not very much, they talk fast and incomprehensibly, and they basically act on every crazy impulse they have. They're like, this seems like fun, let's do this. One example, the book mentions a psychiatrist who once you have bipolar, it's generally lifelong. Usually you get diagnosed like 18 to 25. Generally does not go into remission. Generally it's just managed with medication. But anyways, this person, when she was having one of her manic phases in her 20s, went to a bookstore and bought every book by Penguin Publishing. And when she was asked why she did this, she said, I thought it would be nice if the penguins could have a colony. So, a lot of that kind of stuff. So, as I say, people alternate between these two, typically lasting weeks to months each. There are two types, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1 is the standard case in which you have the manic phases, or you have mania. Bipolar 2 is associated with what's called hypomania. So not quite full-blown mania. Diet mania, if you like. As I mentioned earlier when I showed that graph, this is highly heritable. So if an identical twin has it, you're at a much greater chance of that. Funny enough though, genes associated with an increased risk of having bipolar disorder are also associated with increased creativity. The same is true for schizophrenia. So some genes may be a double-edged sword, so to speak. Speaking of schizophrenia, that's what's next. Any questions on bipolar before we move on? Okay, so schizophrenia falls under the broad umbrella of psychosis or psychotic disorders. There are other versions, but schizophrenia is really the paradigm case of a psychotic condition. There are other more mild versions, but this is sort of weapons grade psychosis. As I mentioned earlier, many people, for some reason, have gotten the idea into their heads that schizophrenia means split personality or multiple personality. The word does come from a word for split, but it doesn't mean a split within yourself. It means a split from reality. That's the etymology of the term. So, like all the psychotic conditions, schizophrenia involves some kind of break from reality. So, the standard symptoms, which we'll go through in more detail now, are things like delusions and hallucinations. So, believing crazy things, hearing voices, or seeing things that are not there, and some other symptoms we'll talk about. All of those are what are meant by a break from reality. So, nothing to do with personality or anything like that. So the core issue here is irrationality or unrealistic thinking. The symptoms are divided between positive and negative. This does not mean good and bad. The same is true, actually, later today I'm lecturing on conditioning, including reward and punishment. the same is true there. Negative and positive in psychology mean addition and subtraction. So positive, something new is added. Negative, something is taken away. So the same is true. That's too bad. The same is true in like conditioning. So negative reinforcement, people think, oh, that's punishment, but it's not punishment. Negative again doesn't mean bad; it means something is taken away. In the case of symptoms, positive means some new behavior or new kind of thinking has been added. Negative means some kind of thinking is no longer there, or some kind of functioning is no longer there. So I'll start with the positive ones. The two main ones are hallucinations and delusions. So hallucinations are perceptual or sensory experiences in the absence of a stimulus. So there's no thing in the environment that's causing the hearing or the seeing or the touching, but you hear or see or touch something anyways. So the most common is hearing voices. There's no one in the room, you're just there, or there could be other people, but you're hearing a voice. And it's not like hearing a voice in your head where you're aware, but like to you, it seems like there really is some sound coming from outside of you. Or visual hallucination, you see something that's not there. Right? Another typical case. I knew someone who actually experienced tactile hallucinations. They felt like someone was touching them even when no one was in the room. So these, of course, can be very frightening experiences. So that's hallucinations. Delusions are beliefs. And what's meant by a delusion here is it's a fixed belief, so it's not resistant, it doesn't change in response to evidence, and it's very irrational. Now you might think, well, we're all a little irrational, so we all have some confirmation bias, but again, this is extreme. Two common types are delusions of persecution and delusions of grandeur. So delusions of persecution involve believing that people are out to get you, or the aliens are coming to get you, or the government is spying on you because you're so special. Delusions of grandeur involve thinking that you are very, very amazing in a special way. So often it's a religious variety. So believing that you are the second coming of Jesus Christ, or that you're God, or whichever, pick your favorite. Or that you're the Queen of England. I saw footage of someone who was arrested. They were, did any of you watch Court Cam? It's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. If you ever feel like, dumb or like you did something foolish, just watch Court Cam. You'll instantly feel better. Because it's basically everything that can go wrong in court. My favorite is when people threaten the judge. I'm like, okay, how can you think this is going to help you? But in one case, this woman was arrested, I think for assaulting a police officer, and she insisted that she be able to speak with her husband, who she claimed was the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. This is a homeless woman in the United States, so probably not. There's a case of this in also the United States. There was one psychiatric hospital that had 3 schizophrenics who each believed that they were Jesus, and they were in the same hospital. And the psychiatrist had the idea to get them to talk to each other, and they hoped it would set in that this just couldn't be right. Sadly, it didn't work, but they made a movie about this called The Three Christs. I haven't seen it. It doesn't look very good, but if you're curious, there is a movie about it. Okay, negative symptoms. One example is flat affect. So, affect in psychology means like emotional state. So piece together what that means then. Flat affect means little to no emotional expression or experience. So very emotionally numb. And I should say, you can have different combinations of symptoms here, as with depression. I forget the cutoff here, but there's a certain number you need in order to qualify. So you can get different presentations. And it may be that, later we do a better job of, dividing it into subtypes. But for now, you get the same diagnosis regardless of what the exact pattern is. Another negative symptom is catatonia, which is the absence of movement. So for long periods of time, some schizophrenics will just sit motionless. To the point where you can grab their arm and put it up here, it'll stay up here. As if their head's off in space or something. Some other symptoms that you don't have to worry about classifying. Schizophrenics often engage in disorganized speech, or sometimes colloquially called word salad, kind of a mean phrase for it, but if you imagine taking a bunch of words and putting them in a bowl and mixing them up, that's basically what this is. So they'll speak for long, and they can have a good vocabulary, but the logical inferences are just not there. They just move from talking about one thing to another, say all kinds of weird things, with no clear logical connections. Another one, which would be different from flat affect, is inappropriate affect. So showing or displaying emotions that are not what you should be feeling in that context. So laughing at a funeral, crying at a normal family event, etc. So, as should be clear, this is one of the worst disorders to find yourself with, right? Very, very serious. Very difficult to lead a normal life. If you have schizophrenia. Though I shouldn't be entirely negative. If you want to see a really good portrayal of this, excellent movie called Beautiful Mind, which is about John Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning mathematician who had schizophrenia. So Russell Crowe does a brilliant job. So if you want to see a good portrayal, there's that. So again, as with bipolar, very heritable. I forget if I said this earlier, but just to repeat the number, in the general population, the rate of schizophrenia is about 1% cross-culturally. But if you have an identical twin with schizophrenia, your odds shoot up to around 50%. At the neurological level, many have argued that high levels of dopamine are involved in schizophrenia. There's different lines of evidence for that. I'm not a psychiatrist, but my impression from the literature is the evidence for that is stronger than the evidence for a connection between low serotonin and depression, but still controversial. Another neurological correlate of schizophrenia is ventricle size. So ventricles are fluid-filled sacs in the middle of the brain. They hold what's called cerebrospinal fluid. So the brain is submerged in this cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And here's a case where the twins don't both have schizophrenia. So they're one of this twin is the lucky case where one twin had it and the other didn't. And this is the twin with schizophrenia. And shouldn't take too long to see, the ventricles are much larger in these schizophrenic twins. Normally, when a part of the brain is bigger, that's prima facie good. But in this case, Enlarged ventricles means brain atrophy. It means parts of the brain have deteriorated or lost volume. And then the fluid-like sacs, or fluid-filled sacs, fill the leftover space. So those are some neurological variables. What about the environment? Now, when we speak of the environment, people usually assume, oh, that means like how your parents treat you and stuff like that. But the environment, strictly speaking, is anything that's not genes. And there's one environmental variable, very well replicated, that might surprise you. If your mother has the flu during the second trimester, you have a statistically increased risk of developing schizophrenia. Well replicated, big samples. You can imagine different mechanisms for that, but the finding is, as I say, well replicated. And that would count as an environmental variable. Okay. Another distinction. So as with bipolar, there's a distinction between type 1 and type 2 schizophrenia. So type 1 is associated with more positive symptoms, and type 2 with more negative symptoms. So that's how the two types are defined. Interestingly, type 1 is usually associated with a faster onset. So there are some cases of schizophrenia, and they're more likely to be type 1 cases, where someone is socially well adjusted, otherwise normal, high functioning, and then within a very short window of time, they lose their minds. Almost always it's between the ages of 18 and the mid-20s. It's very unusual to see it at other times. And they'll, so again, within a short window of time, they go completely crazy and show lots of symptoms. Paradoxically, this is associated with a better treatment prognosis. You're more likely to respond to medication or other treatments if you're the fast onset type. Other times, and this is again more likely to be type 2, someone is already showing signs of problems in their childhood and teen years, various red flags, and gradually develop schizophrenia. And those cases are associated with less successful treatment response. Okay, any questions about schizophrenia? So, both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, as I say, usually emerge in young adulthood. The next few disorders we'll talk about are disorders of childhood. These are developmental problems that emerge early in life. And the first one we'll talk about is autism spectrum disorder. So there are different ways to build up to this, but I'll start by saying autism is a cluster of symptoms that go together. And a lot of them have to do with social problems. So difficulty reading people, difficulty reading social cues, less eye contact. Early, if it's an extreme case, this may mean they don't learn language, so that they're unable to absorb language. they have restrictive interests and rigid behavior patterns. Early in life, this can mean like doing the same motion over and over again. When they're older, this can mean rigid scheduling and stuff like that. And it can mean obsessive interests in one narrow thing. In prior editions of the DSM, they distinguished between autism and Asperger's syndrome. How many of you have heard the phrase Asperger's? So where autism was restricted for the cases where they had that set of symptoms and were low functioning, so like low IQ, difficulty being independent, and Asperger's was reserved for the cases where they were average or above average intelligence. So as many of you may know, famously, many people have autism, but high levels of intelligence. I'll report anecdotally, academia, it's a good place for people with autism. Definitely a disproportionate number of people who have this or who are close to this. I was never diagnosed. I did have one teacher who suspected I might have it. I'm probably a few symptoms short, but possible. A related, or I shouldn't say related, a core problem that connects many of the symptoms is difficulty with what developmental psychologists call theory of mind. So, theory of mind is the understanding that other people have different minds from you. So, I have my beliefs and desires, but other people have different ones. So this develops in normal kids or neurotypical kids around the age of 3 or 4, but people with autism show delays in acquiring theory of mind, and often problems even in adulthood. So this is one with a large sex difference. There are more men with autism. In fact, how many of you know Borat, Sacha Baron Cohen? So his cousin, as it happens, is arguably the world's expert on autism, and he once said that to be male is to have a mild form of autism. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying Simon Baron Cohen said that. One famous character who is pretty much the walking definition of autism is Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. Now, the creators of the show insist that he doesn't have it. He pretty much, again, the symptoms are all there, so I'll show a compilation of Sheldon. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not making fun. Sheldon is a national treasure, but these are some good examples of different symptoms of autism. So, as far as different causes, one theory that made its rounds in pop culture after a paper, which was later retracted for fraud, claimed that certain childhood vaccines cause autism. There's now large meta-analyses contradicting that. My favorite refutation of this is the following website. So it's www.howdovaccinescauseautism.com. And there you go. And then a link to a meta-analysis. Okay, any questions on autism? So another childhood disorder, again, more common in boys on average, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. I lied. Before that, one more thing about autism, there's something called savant syndrome. This is a condition that is almost always associated with autism, by which I mean almost everyone with savant syndrome has autism, but the reverse is not true. Most people with autism don't have this. So you can think of this as like a narrow subset of people with autism. Savant syndrome, these are people who, generally speaking, are low functioning in most domains of life, but they have one freakishly good ability. Like they can memorize an entire book upon one reading. Or you ask them, what's 832 times 75? They can do it right away. So they'll have one kind of extreme ability like that, but otherwise generally low function. So one famous representation of this, inspired by a true story, is the movie Rain Man. Have any of you seen Rain Man? So this is a guy who, he was institutionalized. They thought he had an intellectual disability, which in most domains he did, but his brother finds out that he actually is a savant when someone drops a bunch of toothpicks on the ground, and in 1 second he can count how many there are. So that would be another example. Okay, so sorry, back to ADHD. So attention deficit, so low levels of attention, difficulty, so it shows up, they have difficulty paying attention in class, but high levels of energeticness and activity. That's the hyperactivity part. This is a controversial diagnosis. No doubt there are cases of people who have serious problems along these lines, but many people argue that many of the diagnoses are cases where people are medicalizing ordinary human behavior. If you have younger siblings or cousins, young kids are kind of energetic and wild. Like that's part of being a kid. And some have argued that, because I should say the number of diagnoses has gone up a lot in recent years. Maybe some of that is identifying more real cases, but some of that might be, as I say, overdiagnosis, kind of medicalizing normal human behavior. I mean, sitting still for 6 hours in school is very unnatural. It's not something we evolved to do. So if some percentage of kids have trouble with that, it's not clear we should be calling that a disorder. I mean, as a concrete example, I had a summer gig once as a camp counselor. I was in, there were several cabins. We would do like group activities together. I was in charge of babysitting 7 boys who were about 10 to 13. Of the 7, 3 of them did not have a diagnosis of ADHD. Now, 2 of them had serious problems, I'm willing to say. The other 2, I mean, yeah, they were kind of hyper, but they were 10-year-old boys. I mean, it's not all that weird. I mean, it was stressful keeping all 7 of them alive. The room I was in charge of was on the 2nd floor. I remember I went to the washroom and came back, and there were only 6 of them, and the window was open. And I said, "Where's such and such?" And they just point at the open window. I look up, and he's sprawling along the side of the building on the 2nd story. So, anyways, all of them survived, luckily. Okay, so that's ADHD. The next one, conduct disorder. So this is basically the kid version of psychopathy, or being a psychopath. To be diagnosed as a psychopath, you have to be an adult, but if you have this, a little concerning, let's say. So these are people who have low empathy. Now I should say, people with autism have low empathy in the sense that, in the sense of what psychologists call cognitive empathy. So they have difficulty understanding what someone else is feeling or noticing what someone else is feeling. People with conduct disorder have low emotional empathy. So they can tell that someone is suffering, they just have no response. So if I got injured, that somehow, I don't know, one teacher I had, I wasn't there for it. I had him, but I had him a different day of the week. He pulled the screen down, and a big part of the wall came down and knocked him out. That's very funny, so maybe this is a good example, but if I did that after laughing at first, which I would totally respect, by the way, if I got knocked out by the ceiling, I accept that you'll laugh. But if I'm on the ground unconscious, most of you will have an emotional response. Like, oh, is he okay? Like, your heart rate will go up. Even parts of the brain associated with detecting pain will go off. Less so or not at all if you have something like conduct disorder. So less response to seeing other people in pain. And behaviorally, they engage in things like cruelty to animals, break the rules, pick on kids, etc. This will surprise none of you, also more common in boys on average. So speaking of psychopathy, this leads us to personality disorders. So I'll go through all of them, except for one of the last ones. So these are good to know, but for the test, I would focus on studying these two, antisocial and borderline. Those are the ones that have been most studied. So personality disorders are stable patterns in personality that are not good, let's say. Maladaptive is the fancy term for it, but and as I say, they have to be stable, so long-lasting patterns in behavior and thinking. So there are three clusters. The first cluster is the so-called odd or eccentric cluster. These have a kind of family resemblance to disorders like schizophrenia. So you can think of these as patterns in thinking and behavior that are irrational and otherwise odd, but maybe don't rise to the level of schizophrenia. So the first one is paranoid, which should be pretty self-explanatory. So think back to the delusions of persecution. That's what these people have a lot of. So they are constantly thinking that people are out to get them in some way. Schizoid personality disorder, so as it says here, so less emotional expression, so maybe something kind of like flat affect, and generally little interest in relationships with other people. So they may, go off to be hermits in the woods or whatever. This is different from something like social anxiety disorder, where people with that disorder want to be close to people, they're just afraid for various reasons. These people seem to not give a shit. And then schizotypal is maybe the most similar to schizophrenia. So irrational beliefs and various other schizophrenic-like symptoms. The next cluster, so the first two I'll come back to and say more about, but just briefly, antisocial personality disorder. I forgot to say this on Monday, but this does not mean antisocial in the everyday sense. Normally when we say someone's antisocial, we mean like they're kind of a loner, which maybe that's closer to what is meant by schizoid, but people with antisocial personality disorder are usually extroverted. They're not shy. These are people who are outgoing, socially confident, but they have low levels of empathy. This is the most evil one, if you want to put it that way. They lie very easily. They will hurt people to get what they want and not feel guilty about it after. The paradigm case is your classic American serial killer. Now, most psychopaths are not serial killers, but people like Ted Bundy, that's like a paradigm case of a psychopath. Someone who may be extroverted, charming, outgoing, but when push comes to shove, they have no problem hurting people to get what they want. Borderline personality disorder, the core symptom there is emotional instability. So this is closer to what everyday people think what everyday people think bipolar is. So these are people who often this trait expresses itself in relationships. So they'll, say they're madly in love with you one minute and then, threaten to kill themselves the next minute to get you to do something they want. So intense emotional instability. Histrionic. This is attention-seeking. It's marked by attention-seeking behavior. Narcissistic disorder, and then we've already talked about this in a prior chapter. This is probably most of you know that term. An inflated view of self. Correlated with antisocial personality disorder. Psychopaths tend to also be narcissists. The last cluster, which ignore the last one, it's basically the same as OCD. The unifying symptom with cluster C is fear of rejection. That's what unifies them. Avoidant and dependent people deal with this in different ways. So people with avoidant personality disorder, they want to be close to people, but they are so afraid of rejection that they don't get close to people. Whereas dependents take the opposite approach. They get sort of super close. They are very clingy, and they won't speak up for themselves in relationships, whether friendships or romantic relationships. They'll just do whatever the other person wants because, as I say, they're very afraid of rejection. Okay, we have some time. So now I'll zoom in on the one that's, so the two that have been studied the most and the ones that nudge, nudge, hint, hint, you should know for the test are antisocial and borderline. Both of these have large sex differences. Antisocial, more common in men. Borderline, more common in women. So this is from the DSM-5. So in the DSM-5, psychopathy is called, or they don't use the term psychopathy, but a similar pattern of symptoms is called antisocial personality disorder. For a closely related thing is psychopathy, or being a psychopath. And the main test for that is the so-called psychopathy checklist revised, actually made by someone at UBC. And so if you look at these symptoms, you'll get a good flavor for the kinds of behavior patterns you find. This is used mainly for people in prison. So it's a good predictor of who's likely to reoffend once you let them go. So there's a professor in this department, Brian Nadeau, if you ever want to ask about this. One of his early gigs was administering this to sex offenders. So that he would do interviews with people and kind of keep a running tab of how many symptoms they had. The way it works is there's 20 items, and each one you can have a score of 0, 1, or 2. And if you have a score of, so 40 is the highest, of course. And if you have a score of 30 and up, that's the conventional cutoff for being a psychopath. So one of the items is grandiose sense of self-worth, so thinking that you are very, very amazing. And Brian Nadeau tells a story about a guy he was interviewing who had been in and out of prison his whole life, never kept a steady job, never graduated high school. And Brian asked him, what are you going to do when you get out of prison? The man looked at Brian and said, I'm going to be a doctor. So, check for that one. So, as I already said, so low empathy is an early telltale sign. Another early telltale sign is decreased responsiveness to punishment. So punishment, of course, is an effective way of reducing problematic behavior. They seem resistant to this. Even other kinds of conditioning are less effective on people who are at risk for psychopathy. As with everything, it shows evidence of heritability. Interestingly, though, in this case, we actually know of at least one specific gene that's involved. So typically we know about heritability from twin studies, but in this case there's one gene, the MAOA gene. And here there's evidence of what biologists call a gene-environment interaction. So there's a version of this gene that's associated with risk of psychopathy or psychopathic behavior. It's sometimes called the warrior gene. If you want to Google it later, that's kind of an oversimplification. Here's the way it plays out. If you have the risky version of this gene, but you have a normal childhood, you have a low risk of psychopathy or psychopathic behavior. If you have a traumatic or abusive childhood, but don't have the risky gene, again, low risk of psychopathy. The danger is if you have both. If you have both the risky version of the gene and an abusive or traumatic childhood, then you have a substantially increased risk of psychopathic behavior. So as I said, maybe if you want to just keep an image in your head of what a psychopath is like, maybe the paradigm case is someone like Ted Bundy. I'll show a brief video about him. So yeah, that's maybe the paradigm case. Although, as I said, most psychopaths are serial killers. Some of them can be successful in areas like business or politics, being cold and willing to do things to get what you want. It can be of use there. Brian Nadeau said, I don't know if there's actually studies on this, but he said a psychopath would be well suited to being a surgeon because they won't get, normally a normal person has to get used to the emotions that come with that, but a psychopath can just do the job, no emotional responsiveness. Okay, so the remaining bit of the chapter talks about suicide and self-harm. Nothing too much to say here. One thing the book mentions is there's a well-replicated sex difference here, and it depends what you're measuring. So if you're talking suicide attempts, women are much more likely to attempt suicide. But of the narrow, the subgroup who are successful, it's disproportionately men. I think it's something like 3 times more in each case. Something like 3 times more women attempt suicide, but of the successful suicide attempts, something like 3 times more men. This is partly because men, on average, are more likely to choose lethal means, and it could be that some proportion of the unsuccessful suicide attempts are really a cry for help, not a genuine attempt to end one's own life. And that is all I have to say about chapter 15. Any questions? Okay, next week we'll talk about different treatment strategies for these disorders. See you all then.